when we move on to the whole issue of degree days, I mentioned this earlier. Degree days is a measurement of how much temperature above a base temperature. This base temperature is where plants just don't grow because it's just too cold. So as you increase the temperature you basically, what you do is you increase respiration. Respiration gives you more growth, so that the higher the average daily, the more degree hours, the more degree days you have, the faster they grow. This is a very common tool that's used in the fruit and vegetable industry as they measure maturity of a plant, is how many degree days does it take from the time you plant it until it's ready to harvest. So we have this concept of, the higher the temperatures, the faster the plants grow, which of course, once you've got roots and you're basically their plants are transplanted, this can be a good thing. But of course, back when we're looking at unrooted cuttings, this can be a very bad thing, because you don't want the respiration too fast, because the plants really are not basically photosynthesizing as rapidly as they could be, and they can't take up water, so there's water deficiency, so you have a lot of different problems. So some of the early work that we did by one of our colleagues, she did an extensive amount of work looking at the respiration rate and the temperatures at which we get down to the zero respiration point, where the plants basically go into almost a stasis, where if they do photosynthesize, the carbohydrates will increase because they're not being utilized through respiration. But and of course, then also she looked at what higher temperature is respiration increased, which of course causes that depletion that Nathan showed you on that scientific work that shows that, that over time you deplete the carbohydrates, but if you add higher temperatures, it goes even faster. So what she did is she looked at a number of different species, because we were looking at, could we do modified atmosphere packaging, which is a whole technology that's used in lettuce. It's used in a number of vegetables to enhance post-harvest and maintain plant quality during the shipping process. Well, one of the first things that we found is that all of the different species and even the different varieties, because we looked at it at the variety level, what we found is that they had very different respiration rates, which basically make modified atmosphere packaging just impossible to implement. But from that research, what we found was a very interesting set of results, which basically showed us that crops like lantana, the blue line, and you look at how much is the respiration rate, and how they measure it is that they measure about how much CO2, which is a measurement of respiration, is produced per kilogram per hour of plant tissue. So they say this cutting, how much CO2, or what is the respiration of this cutting at different temperatures. So they looked at 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, and 35 degrees centigrade, which of course we know is 40, 50, 60, 70, 80-ish, and then it just gets hot. And that looks at 4 hours of dark storage, and then what happens. And what we see is, if you look at the blue line, which I mentioned is lantana, is that it basically, even at 5 degrees, at very low temperatures, at 40 degrees, it still is respiring. It respires, and if one of the cuttings that we have trouble with early morning harvesting is, of course, lantana, just like the buddleia that Nathan had mentioned. So, and then you have other crops like impatiens or the geraniums, which basically respiration rates are very, very low at the 40-degree temperatures, and basically go up fairly slowly, except for geraniums, which then go up fairly rapidly once you get to 20 to 30 degrees centigrade. So you can see that there's all kinds of different variability here, which basically helped us understand that there are different crops, that some that basically have a rapid rise, which we need to cool them down very rapidly, so to maintain carbohydrates. And then there's others that have a very slow increase, and those we basically can store at lower temperatures, and that we're not as concerned with how rapidly we cool them down. So this has been a very important piece of information as we look at not only the post-harvest handling of them, but also it's a clue as to what we should do as we start sticking cuttings and we hold cuttings. Now, what has it done to the post-harvest? And I think this is important that people understand. This is where we've made a lot of investments, is that we've looked at the harvest transport. And this is, of course, research also that was done early in the cut flower work by Straube and others, which showed that rapid movement from to pre-cooling is very important. What we have here is an old type vehicle that was used to collect cuttings in the greenhouse and take them back to the packing shed where they're basically put into inventory. And what we have here is a infrared photograph of that unit, of that box, out in the greenhouse in the afternoon. And as you can see down on the bottom of the cutting of the box, where it's blue, it's down around 60 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Whereas up on the top, you basically are up to 100 degrees or more. And as we all know is that when it's cool, you don't sweat as much. But when it's warm and very hot, you sweat a lot because your body's trying to cool itself. And of course, cuttings are no different. They'll do exactly the same thing. So what happens is that these were little easy bake ovens of sorts, where they basically, you put the cuttings in it. If they took too much time to get to the packing shed, then basically you could dehydrate them in transit. Of course, this completely changed the handling and time of handling of the cuttings from the harvest to the packing shed. Then when we started looking at what does a modern packing shed look like today? And of course, a modern packing shed basically brings the cuttings in and then puts them through a pre-cooling tunnel, which rapidly drops the inter and intra, more importantly, the intra temperature down, and they're checking the stems to make sure that the temperatures are down and that the humidity is up so that they just don't desiccate those cuttings by running them under very cool temperatures. But they run them through it and then put them into a holding area where they basically will have cool crops that they're maintaining around 38 to 42 degrees Fahrenheit, and then the warm crops, which they're at 50, 55 degrees. Like poinsettias do not do well in a cool chamber, but they will store very well in a warm chamber. And then, of course, the relative humidity is high so that they're not drying these cuttings out. Very important. And then, of course, once they get into shipping, it's really important to have full boxes. This is why when you order cuttings, they're always trying to fill the box up, because a tightly packed box stays colder longer. And it's if you've got a box that's got a lot of air in it because the box isn't full, that basically that air can change temperature very rapidly, which then impacts the bag. And as we talked about earlier, once the bag warms up, then the cuttings start to transpire and the water starts leaving the cuttings and collects on the surface of the bag. So we really want to have a tightly packed box. And of course, the box is normally insulated to prevent both heat and cold, depending upon the time of the year, from infiltrating the inside of the box. And then under warm conditions, they'll tend to put an ice pack in the middle of the box. And what that does is it tends to keep the temperature more modulated. It does not reduce the temperature. It just slows down any increase in temperature. So if you put warm cuttings into a box, guess what they are when you basically take them out? They're warmer. If you take cold cuttings and put them in a box, whether you've got ice in there or not, they tend to be cold when you take them out. It's also important that they thoroughly seal the box. This is one of the early works that George Straube found is that if you basically seal the box by taping the box, it's very important. I know when you receive your box, you go, why do they have so much tape on this box? Well, it's to seal it. It's no different than if you've got an air-conditioned house and a window open. Guess what happens? That room will warm up because of infiltration of air. And all of the places where the box isn't sealed tight, warm air in transit can enter in and basically impact the cuttings. So now let's talk about handling prior to sticking. So now you've gotten your cuttings, they've shown up in the box. One of the first things you want to do is to check that box. You want to check that bag to see, do we have water on the inside of the bag? That's a flag that says, aha, we've got an issue we need to address. You want to check the intra-stem temperature. Do not go and measure the bag, because that's just measuring the plastic temperature, an irrelevant piece of information. Open the bag, point in there, notice the little red dot in there measuring the cutting itself to see what are the stem temperatures. Making sure that you've got them down to temperature. Get them down to temperature as rapidly as possible. Get them, because we know that without a temperature bounce, where the temperature travels, they don't have moisture in the bag, they basically, stem temperatures are cold upon arrival, those can store longer. But if you've got cuttings that have bounced during transit, have water on the bag, those need to be immediately stuck as rapidly as possible, or put into a cold, very humid green storage area to basically rehydrate them. Remember that 100% hydration, even when you look at the degree days, because if you, even at warmer temperatures, if you have a very humid environment, you basically continue to rehydrate them even at warmer temperatures. So if you don't have a 40 or 45 degree chamber, but you've got to use a 60 degree, it's better. 60 with humidity is infinitely going to be better. In fact, it's going to be way better than if you basically had 40 with none. So make sure that you've got to use humidity as a way to compensate for your inability to have cool temperatures. Airflow should be minimized. This should have dead air, because a lot of airflow basically helps dry cuttings out, because that basically changes the temperature between the cuttings, and you want to really minimize that. So let's talk about rooting temperature, because that's really important, because you want to be accumulating temperature to basically now get the process going, because roots development is a respiration process. Growth is a respiration. Just as when you have a little baby, like Nathan, and I'm sure he can attest to this, is that when his son basically starts eating, a couple days later, he grows. And we've seen this with a teenager that you send up one night and they come back as a little monster, looks like they've grown 2 feet, because they basically, but before that, they eat and eat and eat in anticipation of growing. So we want to make sure that they've got the carbohydrates, and then we want to get them into the right temperatures to get them to grow very effectively. And of course, what do we want to grow when we're rooting cuttings? The step one is we want roots. Without roots, we have nothing. So we need to get those roots. And so we really want to get root. And remember, I mentioned earlier about callus proliferation is a warm, wet process. So we want to get the callus, which is in the soil, warm to basically promote very rapid root development. Because if you think about what callus does, is callus basically breaks apart the pith. The pith is that area between the outside epidermis and basically the vascular bundle. That's the tissue between there. And basically it basically softens that up so that the root that's coming off the vascular bundle can easily pass through the pith and get to the outer epidermis, and then pass through the outer epidermis. You want to soften that tissue up so that the roots can come out rapidly. So one of the things that has been done very nicely recently was some research on Gara, which is somewhat of a difficult plant to root at times. And they looked at the temperature and light intensity, the moles per day. So under very low light intensity, rooting, of course, is consistently very bad. As you increase the light intensity, which is the next line coming from the bottom, over time, you can see that you get better rooting when the temperatures are warmer. And of course, then if you start getting even higher light conditions, then you can have even more, up to a point where you have it can be too warm. Just like too much light, too warm is also. So as a rule of thumb, somewhere around 24 degrees, which is around 75 degrees Fahrenheit is really the ideal temperature for that root. And so using your infrared thermometer to check your soil temperature, using soil probes, whatever you're using, use it. And especially during the winter, because one of the things you have to remember is that at night, the soil temperature, when you're putting heat into the greenhouse from below, it's evaporating water, and evaporating water cools the soil. So it's not uncommon to drop the soil temperature by 4 or 5 degrees during the night, just because of evaporative cooling. So then we want to look at what is the air temperature. For stage 1 and 2, where you really don't want any top growth, you want it all down below in the roots. That's when you get callus and you get root initials starting. That's where you want the air temperature to be very cool. Once we get to stage 3, when we're wanting to start it to grow, one of the things that you can do is using diff. Diff is the day minus the night temperature, work that was done at Michigan State many years ago, that basically showed that if you have a 0 or negative day minus night, so you have a 60-degree day and a 65-degree night, day 60 minus 65 night gives you a -5-degree diff. A -5-degree diff will keep the plants more compact than the reverse, where you had a 65-degree day and a 60-degree night, which is 65 minus 60 is a +5, those plants will grow. So usually about 10 degrees. So if you got 70 and 60, that's going to be a problem. If it's 80 and 60, that's a bigger problem. You get more and more stretch. And even with the use of LEDs, the use of LEDs makes it less stretchy, but they still stretch, because diff is a very powerful phenomena. But also be aware of the average daily temperature. This is that whole degree data. We have to accumulate a certain amount of heat units over time to maximize growth, or they're too slow. That's why we're normally looking at 68, 75 degrees average daily temperature. So you take the day plus the night, average it together, that gives you the average. That basically gives you a maximum growth rate. So we're really looking at this, what is the air temperature once we've got roots underneath us?